Tonight on NewsCenter, after a 3.5-year freeze, the leaders of Korea and Japan sit down for their very first one-on-one. Seoul's presidential office says the two heads of state agreed to make efforts to settle the so-called comfort women issue at an early date. Zero tolerance. Defense chiefs of South Korea and the U.S. vowed zero tolerance for any provocation by North Korea. They want Pyongyang to immediately cease all activities related to its nuclear program. And who works the longest hours in the world? Not a surprise if you work in Korea, but this country puts the most hours in, only behind #1 Mexico. Find out why. It's Monday, November 2nd, 2015. Good evening to those of you in Korea and hello to our viewers around the world. This is the first edition of NewsCenter. I'm Geun-hye. Earlier this Monday, President Park and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe sat down for their first ever bilateral summit. The meeting came after a 3.5-year freeze and with thorny matters such as the decades-old issue of the Japanese military's enslavement of women leading up to and during World War II. Our presidential office correspondent Hwang Sang-hee reports.
Topping the agenda at President Park's first-ever summit with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women. At the start of the talks, President Park expressed her hopes for the summit.
오늘 회담이 아픈 역사를 치유할 수 있는 대승적이고 또 진심 어린 그런 회담이 돼서 앞으로 양국 관계를 발전시켜 나가는 소중한 계기가 되기를 기대합니다.
However, Prime Minister Abe's focus was on building a future-oriented relationship with Seoul.
I think highly of the steps we took in Japan-Korea relations over the last 50 years. I am willing to work with President Park to open a new era for a future-oriented Japan-Korea relationship.
More than 200,000 women, mostly Korean, were forced to serve the Japanese military before and during World War II. And with only 47 comfort women remaining in Korea, President Park urged for a swift resolution, calling it the biggest stumbling block to their bilateral relations. The presidential office of Cheongwade said the two leaders agreed to work on the issue.
The two leaders acknowledged that this year marks the 50th anniversary of normalizing diplomatic ties and commanded that the comfort women talks be sped up so the issue can be resolved as early as possible.
Other agenda items included increasing cooperation on countering North Korean threats, as well as Korea's possible joining of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Prime Minister Abe said he was closely following Korea's movements regarding the 12-nation trade pact that includes Japan and the U.S. The presidential office of Cheongwade says Monday's summit was meaningful as it paved the way for resolving historical issues and laid the groundwork for further progress in bilateral relations. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
And we will be joined live by our Hwang Sang-hee later this hour for a more behind-the-scenes look at summit talks from the presidential office. Now, Korea and Japan have agreed to speed up talks to resolve the issue of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women. Although Japan has at times admitted wrongdoing, its prevailing stance is that it bears no responsibility. Our Kwon Jang-ho looks back on this contentious history.
From the 1930s until the end of the Second World War, an estimated 200,000 women from Korea, China, and other Japanese-occupied territories were kidnapped and forced to provide sexual services to Japanese frontline troops. Most of the victims remained silent for over 40 years, until Kim Hak-sun came forward in '91 and filed a lawsuit against the Japanese government. Dozens followed her lead, putting the Japanese government under pressure to begin their own investigations. It resulted in the 1993 Kono Statement, which admitted the Japanese military was involved in the establishment and management of brothels, and that many victims were recruited against their own will. Korea welcomed this statement, but conservatives in Japan criticized it, saying there was not enough evidence of coercion and that most women joined voluntarily. In 1995, the clearest apology to date was made by Prime Minister Tomichi Murayama, which launched the Asian Women's Fund to compensate victims. But many survivors rejected the payment because the money was not coming from the state, but rather private individuals. This was seen as the Japanese government avoiding responsibility. The Murayama statement has been officially upheld by subsequent governments, including the current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's, but he has also openly questioned its validity. Earlier this year, during a speech marking the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, Abe avoided a full apology and simply expressed remorse and condolences for Japan's wartime actions. It is these kinds of elusive statements that victims take issue against. They are looking for a clear and unambiguous apology and an acceptance of history that cannot be disputed. Kwon Jang-woo, Arirang News.
Adding Beijing's entrepreneurship initiative onto Seoul's creative economy drive, that's how Chinese Premier Li Keqiang says he'll maximize the synergy between Korea and his country. Arirang News Foreign Affairs correspondent Song Ji-sun has been following Premier Li's three-day stay here in Seoul.
I'm glad Korea and China have had meaningful talks through this visit, and we will now work together for a prosperous future through joint efforts and cooperation.
With Monday the last day of his visit, China's Premier Li Keqiang sat down with South Korea's Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-an. At a forum designed to foster youth exchange and collaboration through a creative economy, two ministers discussed ways to establish a Korea-China innovation platform, pledging to set up an innovation complex in Midwest China for young leaders in the two countries. Li said that now is the best time to beef up youth exchanges between the two countries in both academics and employment. Before departing, Li visited an innovation center in Gyeonggi-do province to see how Seoul nurtures IT startups. Stressing that the two countries are both implementing innovation strategies, Li said that Beijing also wants to incorporate President Park's creative economy drive into Beijing's entrepreneurship initiative. It is time for some action. Li says he hopes the two countries can transform their mutual agreement into actual achievements, and that this visit is the first stepping stone in upgrading their bilateral relations to a new level. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Well, Premier Li Keqiang's visit to Korea has opened the door for 3 of Korea's trademark foods to reach Chinese households. Our Kwon So-ah has more on this delicious excursion.
Many people will be able to enjoy this delicious food once it's imported to China.
That delicious food Chinese Premier Li Keqiang talked about during his visit to Korea is samgyetang, a traditional Korean ginseng chicken soup. Korean President Park Geun-hye and Li signed a number of MOUs on the sidelines of their bilateral summit over the weekend, including an agreement to have Korea export 3 of its signature food products, rice, kimchi, and samgyetang.
I think it's a good idea because I tried samgyetang at a restaurant, but never seen it packaged and sold in China.
Experts say in the short term, the 3 products won't largely increase Korea's export figures, but it'll make an impression.
It is very meaningful and important in terms of harmonizing food safety system between the two countries. The Chinese government actually changed their food safety regulation to receive our most representative product.
Breaking it down, exporting rice represents a long-awaited yes from Beijing since Seoul's request to open the market back in 2009. For Korea's favorite fermented cabbage side dish kimchi, the MOU supports hopes of narrowing a deficit. Last year, kimchi exports accounted for only 1/10 of its imports, while those imports were 99% from none other than China.
Both Korean rice and kimchi taste good. I enjoy them and would buy them if they're exported to China.
Anticipation is spreading fast as stocks of Korea's major chicken companies skyrocketed Monday. The latest arrangement, however, has no legal binding to the Korea-China FDA, which still needs to be ratified by both sides. Experts say if everything goes smoothly, people in China will have Korean kimchi on their plates by the end of the year, rice in January, and samgyetang in the first half of next year. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Let's go through the rare summit talks between the leaders of South Korea and Japan. Arirang's presidential office correspondent Hwang Sang-hee joins me live in the studio. Now, Sang-hee, the two leaders have encountered each other at multilateral meetings, but have never really sat down for substantive conversation up until today.
That's right, Geun-hye. And I think the greatest attention was on whether President Park and Prime Minister Abe would make any substantial progress on the so-called comfort women issue. Now, this has been the thorniest subject between the two countries as Seoul seeks Tokyo's sincere apology and compensation, while Japan continues to say the issue was resolved decades ago. Now, here's what one expert in Seoul thought about today's summit.
It's as if Korea vented by itself, which lessens the significance of the summit. It's regrettable that Japan didn't leave some space or take real measures to actively solve this issue.
Last week, in an interview with Japanese dailies Asahi Shimbun and Mainichi Shimbun, President Park expressed hopes that the comfort women issue be resolved by this year. Now, it was the first time she put out a deadline, but it seems like she took a step back at today's summit. Instead of fixing a date, the two leaders just agreed to resolve the issue at the earliest date possible.
So it seems like the two leaders agreed to keep working to resolve this historical issue. Now, Sang-hee, if I remember correctly, there has been a tug of war between the two countries leading up to the planning of the summit as well.
Yes, there was definitely some tension early on as they haggled over issues like the date and the agenda of the talks. Korea tried pressuring Japan by revealing that it proposed to hold the summit on November 2nd. Now, this is a very rare move by Korea since it's customary for both countries to announce such dates together after they reach an agreement. And not surprisingly, Seoul's revelation was flatly denied by Japan the very next day. So expectations for the summit rather low, partly because of this public display of tension.
Well, Sang-hee, judging from Mr. Abe's pretty solitary 2 days here in Seoul, I think it would be hard to say that he felt a heartfelt welcome here in the nation's capital.
That's a very good point, Geun-hye. There was no joint statement, no joint press conference, and the leaders did not even dine together after the summit. In fact, Abe spoke to his reporters separately at a hotel following the summit. An official at the presidential office explained that this is customary since the summit was held on the sidelines of a trilateral meeting. But considering that this was the very first summit between President Park and Prime Minister Abe, and also Abe's very first visit to Korea in 9 years, this sort of reflects the current status of Korea-Japan relations.
Well, I suppose just the fact that the two actually managed to sit down in one room and pose for that obligatory grin and grip session was a diplomatic breakthrough enough in and of itself. What about from here and onwards? I mean, do we still anticipate the ties to be frosty?
Well, Korea-Japan relations weren't expected to suddenly warm up just because of this one summit. The leaders have now broken the ice, and experts say that they could serve this as a fresh turning point as they take baby steps towards mending their relations.
Right, so hopefully that they will actually make this a fruitful event and not just for a talk's sake, and actually make some progress before the G20 and the APEC summit, right?
Right, that's right. They have plenty more chances to talk things out then.
All right, well, Sang-hee, thank you for coming in tonight. Now, for a broader analysis of the regional as well as bilateral ties in the Northeast Asian region, I had a chance to sit down with John Nilsson Wright. He is the head of the Asia program at Chatham House, an international affairs think tank based in London. Let's start off with this trilateral summit between South Korea, China, and Japan. It comes after a gap of 3.5 years. It goes without saying that this will contribute to the improvement of stability in the Northeast Asian region. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you're right to say this is long overdue. There's been a lot of concern in the region, but also further afield in the US, about the lack of dialogue between these three critical Northeast Asian nations. So the fact that they're meeting is a good sign. It's a sign that there is an appetite politically at the levels of the heads of government in each of those countries to try and find a useful framework for further discussion on a range of different issues. China especially would like to see an opportunity to promote its own economic interests. And economic interdependency is something that all three countries, I think, recognize is important and has to be encouraged. So I think the goal for all three states is finding a way in which they can talk about some of these issues and to lay down the foundation for further cooperation.
Let's now move over to South Korea-Japan relations. Of course, the bilateral summit this time around, it marked the very first time that President Park and Prime Minister Abe sat together, just the two of them, a one-on-one since taking office, which I believe is unprecedented.
The worry on the part of public opinion in all those different areas and countries that Japan has not really acknowledged its responsibility during the wartime period of having been the agent behind this program of enforced prostitution. It has been a real sticking point. So what we're seeing, I think, now is an attempt to subtly, from Japan's point of view, indicate to its neighbours, particularly to South Korea, that it takes those concerns seriously, that it's prepared to address them. So I think that's a welcome development.
What do you think would take Japan to settle once and for all this issue of sex slavery by the Japanese military during World War II?
That's a very difficult question. I think the boldest thing that a Japanese leader could do would be to establish a formal fund supported by the government to provide official financial compensation without the ambiguity that was associated with past payments, an official declaration from the government and the provision of direct financial assistance, perhaps also with a letter from the Prime Minister in an official capacity. I think that's probably unrealistic, although who knows, that might be a possibility in the future. It's often said that in terms of making amends for the legacy of the war, symbolic gestures could be quite important.
How do you foresee the relationship between South Korea and Japan unfolding or developing in the immediate to long-term future?
Well, it's always a difficult game, isn't it, anticipating the future. I'm wary of looking too far ahead. I think there are encouraging signs. The summit itself is a very welcome development. I think a healthy sense of pragmatism is evident on both sides. There are many areas in which there can be more cooperation. The challenge of addressing the threat from the DPRK, how best to respond to the challenge of China is not immediately clear whether Tokyo and Seoul are on the same page here. And there have been, of course, concerns, even in Washington, that President Park's overtures to Beijing may be a source of potential division between the US and its two key regional allies, Japan and South Korea. So it's not a trouble-free relationship. The question of China, I would argue, is going to be the biggest challenge because of concerns over regional security, because of questions about how close economically to partner with China. Now, the economic logic of interdependence is very important. The reality that economic connections between countries don't necessarily, of their own accord, produce stability and security. And I think that's going to be probably the number one concern over the next few years. And it will take real leadership on the part of both President Park, Prime Minister Abe, and Xi Jinping to ensure that conflict does not become a source of tension in the region.
Defense chiefs from South Korea and the United States vowed zero tolerance for any military provocations by North Korea. This during today's annual defense talks in this country. Arirang News' Connie Kim joins us from Seoul's Defense Ministry. Connie.
Well, Geun-hye, South Korean Defense Minister Han Min-gu and his U.S. counterpart Ashton Carter signed a joint declaration consisting of 16 clauses. Now, this centers on dealing with and countering North Korean threats and maintaining strong alliance. Take a look.
We have decided to strongly and jointly respond to any of North Korea's provocative threats in the future based on the robust South Korea-US alliance.
Condemning North Korea's test of a submarine-launched ballistic missile in May, Han and Carter also expressed concern over North Korea's possible missile and nuclear testing. With its modified KN-08 intercontinental missile revealed during a military parade last month, and threats of a potential long-range rocket launch, threats from Pyongyang have increased. Stating that North Korean aggression or military provocation will not be tolerated, the U.S. Defense Secretary said North Korea's 2010 torpedo attack on the warship Cheonan and its heavily fortified demilitarized zone are evidence of continuing North Korean threats.
Both are stark reminders that North Korea is an up-close, dangerous, and continuing threat to the security of the peninsula and the region.
To better deal with the North's threats, Han and Carter approved the implementation guidance on the concepts of ROK-US Alliance Comprehensive Counter-Missile Operations, or the 4D operational concept, to detect, disrupt, destroy, and defend against Pyongyang's provocations. The two also reaffirmed their commitment to develop Seoul's missile defense systems, Kill Chain, and the Korea Air Missile Defense System against North Korean missile threats by mid-2020. Until South Korea has full capabilities to conduct intelligence and counter-artillery operations against North Korea, the two allies agreed to delay the planned return of the current Washington-held wartime operational control of South Korean troops. The timing is now expected to be around mid-2020 when Seoul completes its Kill Chain system and the KAMD development. Now, what wasn't discussed was the U.S.-led Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. Now, speculation about that talks had been growing after a Lockheed Martin official said formal and informal discussions were already underway between Seoul and Washington. Now, Carter made clear any possible THAAD deployment on the Korean peninsula would depend on the alliance's decision. And after wrapping up talks on Monday, Carter left for Malaysia, where he is expected to attend the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus and exchange a range of defense ideas with member nations. Geun-hye?
Thanks, Connie, for that. Now, for the average worker here in Korea, it seems life is all about work and very little play. A new OECD report shows Koreans work the second longest hours in the world, trailing only behind Mexico, which topped the list. Shin Se-min looks beyond the numbers.
2,124 hours. That's how many hours the average Korean worked last year. It includes salaried, self-employed, and part-time workers. OECD statistics show that Koreans work the second longest hours among 34 member nations, much higher than countries like the US, Japan, and Germany, which work the least hours. For many in Korea, annual working hours are considerably higher than the OECD average of 1,770 hours. Doing the math, that's 6.8 extra hours per week. Compared to Germans, Koreans worked 1.6 times longer. On top of this, Korea's labor ministry said that workers only used 61% of their annual leave, just 7 days of vacation.
Peer pressure among workers plays a big role. It's difficult getting off work on time, even using all my vacation days.
And the government's flexible, selective working hour system designed to benefit working moms and seniors hasn't been as effective as hoped for.
As a mum, I don't use the selective working hour system because it puts a burden on my colleagues, which in turn puts me in a difficult position.
Slow economic recovery has also forced many self-employed to work late into the night.
I work 19 hours on average, the longest I've ever worked in 12 years of my self-employment.
The ambiguity of tasks and work responsibilities that are often intertwined have been pinpointed as some of the underlying problems.
Increasing the level of part-time workers, which currently stands at 11%, can help cut hours and change the social perception about work environments.
Experts add that full implementation of the simplified wage system that focuses on base salary and job performance is also a way to cut down on long working hours. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
We reported on the Korean economy picking up pace in the third quarter a few weeks ago. We're learning today that it was largely extra government spending that fueled the strongest quarterly growth since 2010. Here's Arirang News' Hwang Ji-hye with details.
Korea's finance ministry says government-led spending and investment boosted the country's third quarter growth by up to 1 percentage point. Considering that the Korean economy grew 1.2% in the 3 months from the previous quarter, it was mainly extra government money that led the strongest quarterly growth since 2010. Between July and September, over 66% of the government's supplementary budget was expended. Korea's traditional growth engine, exports, however, dragged third-quarter growth down by 0.7 percentage points. And with global demand showing little sign of picking up pace due to China's slowing economy, the government plans to maintain its expansionary policy for the time being. But concerns linger over Korea's fiscal health, while the finance ministry claims that Korea cannot just sit and talk about fiscal soundness when all other countries like Japan are in an expansionary mode. The expanded budget will increase the country's overall sovereign debt to over 40% of GDP next year, pushing it to a record high.
The national debt has been steadily rising since 2012 as the government poured extra money into the sluggish economy. But in the face of a rapidly aging society, the figure could spike down the road.
Still, the debt ratio is relatively low compared to other OECD nations, with the average standing at over 110%. In a recent report, the IMF suggested Korea prop up its ailing economy through budget expansion, while adding its fiscal health is the world's second strongest behind Norway. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
The only reasonable explanation for the crash of a Russian passenger jet in Egypt is an external influence. That's according to an executive from the airline that operated the flight. Bruce Harrison joins me live in the studio. Now, Bruce, experts have stressed that airplanes don't just blow up in midair.
Yeah, hello, Pyongyang. And yes, there's still a lot of investigating to do, but you're right. An official of the Russian airline said, in his own words, only an external influence could have brought that plane down.
Now, when you say external influence, are we also talking about a possible attack?
It's really too soon to say, and officials haven't said anything definitive. But at least one expert suggested the possibility of a bomb on board the plane. And for days now, the Islamic State's claimed it shot down the plane in retaliation to airstrikes in Syria by Russia. Now, while investigators are combing through the wreckage on the ground, people are mourning in Russia. The bodies of the dead are arriving in St. Petersburg for identification. All 224 people on board, mostly Russians, had been vacationing in Egypt and were flying home.
It's sad. So many people, children, were on the flight. It's heartbreaking. I have a child myself, and I fly very often.
Both of the plane's black boxes have been recovered and are apparently in good condition. The airline said pilots made no emergency calls to the ground during the flight before it broke up in midair and crashed. Russia's transportation ministry has dismissed the Islamic State's claims, saying there's no evidence to suggest the militants shot down the plane.
Well, we will be looking forward to the investigations. Bruce, so over in Turkey, the ruling party is celebrating a massive victory in parliament. What does that mean for that country?
Well, the biggest takeaway, a return to single-party rule in Turkey. President Erdogan founded the Justice and Development Party, so now that party has control in parliament and the presidency. That's a significant switch for the government in that country. And obviously great for Erdogan's policies, but this may deepen social divisions within the country, considering the Justice and Development Party now has control on so many levels.
Right. There are still 3 other parties in representation in the parliament in that country, but none as close to having as many seats as this ruling party.
That's right. According to at least initial results, the ruling party, new ruling party rather, has 50% of the vote. The main opposition party just controlling about 25% in the election. While celebrating, President Erdogan said the people chose stability by voting for his party.
Once again, I would like to express my gratitude to our people. I am also thankful to see the atmosphere of this election, the democratic maturity our country has reached, and the joy of the people last night.
Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu called the outcome a victory for democracy. The pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party held on to at least 10% of votes as well, so they retained seats in parliament, albeit just a small number. The election was a rerun of a June poll in which the Justice and Democratic Party surprisingly lost its one-party rule due to a surge in support for the People's Democratic Party.
Now on to sports. Once one of the worst teams in Major League Baseball has won the World Series. In fact, the Kansas City Royals have defeated the New York Mets.
Yeah, Geun-hye, I have no doubt Royals fans are still partying in Kansas City, even as the sun comes up and people prepare to go to work in that part of the world. It's a big deal. It's been 30 years since they took a title. And, you know, there weren't a lot of happy seasons in between now and that 1985 victory.
Right. I mean, it's got to be such a relief for the fans because just last year they lost Game 7.
Yeah, it was a tight game. It came down to the final out, close all the way. San Francisco Giants on top. But most of those players have come back to win the World Series this year. So it's redemption of sort for the Royals. You know, this game they fought back from a 2-0 deficit and tied the score in the 9th inning. The Royals then blew the game open with a five-run 12th inning to win the series. Kansas City is one of baseball's smallest markets, but obviously one of the most powerful now, and its fans are some of the most dedicated in the league. The city dyed many of its fountains royal blue, and some statues were dressed in Royals jerseys. This is only Kansas City's second title, by the way. And Pyongyang, if you check out some videos online, you'll see fans in bars throughout northeast Kansas, especially the prominent Power and Light District, celebrating well into the night. It was pretty crazy out there.
Are you a Royals fan?
You know, I lived in that area for a year, so they're one of my favorite teams.
All right. Well, Bruce, congratulations to you, and I will see you tomorrow.
All right, see you tomorrow. Thanks, Geun-hye.
Well, it felt more like an autumn day today compared to the cold temperatures we've had over the last few days. So is this nice toasty weather here to stay? Let's go over to our Ji-hyun. Ji-hyun, so is the cold snap going to come back?
Well, as the autumn cold snap finally eased up today and temperatures are back to seasonal averages, so it's a good news, huh?
So we have a little more time, you're saying, to enjoy the nice fall weather here in Seoul?
Well, temperature-wise, yes, but the level of fine dust and ultra-fine dust are forecast to rise again, at least for tomorrow in the central regions, including here in the capital, while the rest of the peninsula will also get moderately high levels of fine dust at times. But again, conditions will stay mild, but do expect a chilly start tomorrow morning, but at warmer afternoon is expected compared to today. And dry conditions continue. An advisory remains in place in Seoul, so please take necessary precautions. On that note, let's take a closer look at the readings for tomorrow. Seoul will get up to 18, while Daegu and Gwangju will climb up to 19, and Busan tops out at 20. And as for the other regions, Daejeon and Jeju Island will see a high of 18 and 19, while Dokdo rises to 17. Now, it seems like similar autumn conditions will persist this week, with rain in the forecast for the upcoming weekend. Well, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that is our broadcast on this Monday evening here in Seoul. Thank you everyone for staying with us. We'll see you right back here, same time on NewsCenter.